Well, Jared is from a family of gardeners. They love the outdoors, they love gardening, and that kind of pushed him over to the world of horticulture. He's developed quite a passion for horticulture. He went to University of Tennessee, Martin, in Martin, Tennessee, for a bachelor's in environmental biology. After completion of his work there, he came to NC State, got a master's degree in horticulture and floriculture, working primarily with plant nutrition aspects. And he's pursuing his PhD also in plant nutrition with Dr. Brian Victor. He's held numerous jobs that led him to horticulture. He was a Scott Arboretum Swarthmore intern in, I think, 2008. He enjoys photography, hiking, sharing his enthusiasm for plants by giving gardening talks and writing articles. Particularly, he's written articles for Carolina Gardener and Conifer Quarterly. He's traveled to a number of different countries, 9 different countries, and learned about horticulture there. He aspires to be a college professor and share his enthusiasm and passion for horticulture with those students. And Jared, we're interested in what you got to say tonight. Come on up.
All right, thanks, sir. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that y'all are very, very lucky tonight, because tonight is Shag Dancing in North Hills, and so I have come here to give a talk to y'all. So I'm just letting you know, like, how worthwhile you are as people, that I'm taking a night away from my beach music to come here and talk to y'all about plants. But not only is dancing a passion of mine, but so is plants as well too. I have a theme of talks is called The Rambling Roots, and I gave a talk back in January to the Rock Society about my travels around the world, and the whole theme of it is that we gardeners, we travel around, we see a lot of different plants, we see a lot of different things. Sometimes they're far away places, sometimes they're right out on our back door. But I feel like we as gardeners then have a responsibility to share this information, to share this knowledge. And so I compare us to roots, that we're out there sort of rambling around the world, rambling through the earth, trying to look for these new things about gardening to teach others. And so usually these talks revolve around, places that it costs $2,000 to go to, Vancouver, Switzerland, all these places, show you these massive, nice castles. But tonight I wanted to do an interesting twist. Tonight's talk is on North Carolina, because I feel like that we here in the Raleigh area have, and throughout North Carolina, have a lot to see horticulturally. There's a lot of great horticulture here in this state. And 5 years ago, whenever I came to Raleigh, I did not know even like 1/100th of what I'm about to show you. So we've got a lot to look at tonight. We've got a lot of interesting gardening stories and plants and people to talk about. And so if you'll join me, I'll take you on a journey through the past 5 years of my time here in North Carolina. But first, I want to take you back before I came to North Carolina to a family vacation trip that we came and went and took in Highlands, North Carolina. My mom read in Southern Living, I'm sure, about how the waterfalls there were beautiful. And so we went there and saw, this is one of the first photographs I ever took in North Carolina. This is Dry Falls over near Highlands. You can actually take and walk back behind that waterfall, and sort of that mist blows on you. And even at this early age, with this little El Cheapo camera that I had, we were able to see some interesting plants like Goodyear. We also saw some interesting Lilium species out in the, it's interesting to go back 7 years ago and see that even then I was already taking photographs of plants back then. But North Carolina actually left a slightly bitter taste in my mouth, and it wasn't necessarily something about the state. It was something very, very ignorant that I did. I bent down and took a photograph on this stream right here, put the photograph in my camera, turned around, and out-plopped the camera into the stream. And so my first trip to North Carolina, I basically lost the ability to take photographs, but with that came a new chapter, because that Christmas, my family pulled together and got me a Nikon D40. So it was sort of a win-win situation, and North Carolina is already starting to earn some points. First, I want to look locally. What kind of horticulture do we have going on here in the Triangle? Whenever I was back in Tennessee, I heard about a couple of places. Whenever people found out I was going to North Carolina, they said, oh, you have to go to Plant Delights. Tony Avent. One of the first things I remember about Tony was that if you want to get a catalog, send him a box of chocolates, which instantly got him on my good side, or send him 10 stamps. And the spring before I left Tennessee, I got my parents one of these Thailand giant colocasias, gave it to them, and of course they sent me photographs of it as it grew over the summer. And this one here, I was able to take it, down at Tony's, so it was interesting to see those connections between the plants. North Carolina Botanic Garden, of course, its great mission about preserving native plants, propagating native plants like the longleaf pine, and then of course Michaud's sumac, which is very, very rare. They're trying to do a lot of conservation efforts on it, trying to figure out how to propagate that. Even a friend of mine here at State worked on that a little bit. And then of course Duke Gardens. I remember one of the Master Gardeners in our club came up and she said, "You've got to go look at the wisteria soon after you got there." So a lot of these places that I'm showing you, I visited within the first month after I came here to North Carolina to go and see these places. Of course, in August the wisteria wasn't blooming, but it gets the point across. Of course, there were some new horticulture places. I remember one day I was driving down the road with one of my coworkers, and we passed by Meredith campus, and all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I just saw like these great gumdrops hanging on this tree, and I was like, "What is that?" And so, we turned around, went back and looked, and sure enough, it looked like it was a purple robinia. I'd never seen this before in Tennessee. And so later on that weekend, I went back to the Greenway, saw they had a purple form, they had pink form, and by this time, I'd already started getting plugged in with some of the people in the area, and so I emailed my friend Aaron, who curates the gardens at Meredith, and said, what are these robinias? I'd love to know more about it. And he said, come on over, I'll give you a tour. And so I went over there before I went into campus one day. So it was a very, very early morning tour. He showed me a lot of great things like this Philadelphus Natchez. Meredith is doing a lot of great things horticulturally. Aaron is trying to turn it sort of into the Swarthmore of the South. He's beginning to build up this magnolia collection that they have here, and also going in and redoing a lot of these nice courtyards. This is just right across the street. It's just right here, right in our backyard, for us to experience. Like I said, he's doing a lot with magnolias. This is Magnolia ashii, which is very, very precocious. It flowers in its third year, so it typically flowers as a shorter, shrubby-like tree. And then earlier this winter, we went over and saw a lot of the other different magnolias that were flowering there whenever the J.C. Raulston and Arboretum and also Meredith co-hosted the Magnolia Symposium. So learned a lot and saw a lot with that group as well. Some of the professors at State have opened up their gardens to me. I went to Denny Werner's and saw for the first time this variegated manihote, which I also saw down in Costa Rica just a couple of months ago whenever I went down there. They didn't have the variegated form, but they had, they were just growing out in the fields, and they just go out and pull it up and shave off a root and then turn it into like a mashed potato mixture. So I overwintered one of these well in my apartment this year, so you can grow it in your garden and just bring it in over the winter and it'll do okay for you. Great foliage, wonderful. I started making a lot of new friends after I moved here. I met Brie Gluvna at the Garden Writers Conference that was held a few years ago. And so she said, come on out, see me at Camellia Forest. There's a lot of great camellias out there. But one of my favorites that she showed me was of course, our tea camellia, Camellia sinensis, the camellia that the teas that we drink are made from. And so she showed me that you can grow this plant, harvest 2 leaves and a bud, and you can dry them and make your own tea. And if you go and read Endure, he'll tell you about what a great shade, woody shrub this is, that it is a really good performer. It'll tolerate a lot of different conditions. Sure, the flowers are small and stuff, but hey, it's still a great plant, and it sort of also introduces a little bit of an edible component to the landscape as well. Going up to David Spain's garden up in North Raleigh, he's gotten a lot of publicity now about doing the moss rocks. And last summer, I went with Bree and a couple other friends who had come over from Nashville. We toured David's garden and saw basically how he has just created a landscape of moss and how he has made that beautiful and how he curates it. And if you notice, there are a couple of different species of moss that he's been able to weave together and sort of grow there in his garden. North Carolina State Fair. I do not like the fair. I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. Just way too many people. Way too many people. I can be around tons of plants all day long, but I'm people claustrophobic. But I went this year because I had some friends who had done some projects, and also because I'd really never actually been during the daytime and checked it out. But I was so amazed at the horticulture there. Like some of these exhibits where they took and they repurposed some of these ideas that you see a lot on Pinterest and Facebook now. And also, of course, some of the different sculptures that the NC State student made, where he made the barrel monster, and now he made a praying mantis as well too. So again, interesting, quirky, whimsy horticulture at the NC State Fair. The Coker Arboretum is another good place to go see some large, mature trees. I dated a girl for like a month over at UNC, and I think the best thing I got out of it was that I learned that this awesome pine was there. We go there for walks. It wasn't my fault, by the way, just but we go there, and I was like, wow, look at this beautiful tree. It has the most beautiful bark on it. It's one of the 5 or 6 native pine species to the southeast Pinus glabra. So really a great tree, really neat. Montrose, of course, go there and then see in the fall and the late autumn, see the autumn flowering galanthus, and then of course you can appreciate them from a distance, but of course then you can lay down and look at them and take some photographs of them as well too. I always sort of love seeing these upside down hearts on them. I'm a little bit of a galanthophile myself. It's just, again, I live in an apartment, so I don't really have anywhere to grow a whole lot of them yet. And the Charles Keith Arboretum. Charlie is a great guy. He's a species collector. That's one of the first things that he'll tell you whenever you go to his arboretum. He'll say, I don't really deal with a lot of cultivars because I collect so many species. He'll tell you, like, I've got all the Stewartias and all these other ones. And so this is one of the first Willemias that I saw in North Carolina as well, too. In fact, I think it's the only one that I've seen here thus far. I've only seen it a couple of times around the U.S., but of course, this was the pine that I think this was the conifer, that was discovered down in Australia in around 1994. So very rare, very uncommon, very different. But he had, this sort of shows you the type of eclectic collector that he is. Now, once we sort of begin to get outside the triangle, there's more great horticulture here in the triangle, but of course, we're limited in time tonight. So next we're going to go on to the triad and see some of the great things that I've seen there. And one of the first places that I found in the triad was the Paul J. Ciener Botanic Garden. I love this garden, but man, this is the hardest word to spell ever. I after E, or I after E except after C, and every time I spell it wrong. It's just like, you think that like they would have changed their name or something before. But anyway, great garden, even though it's very frustrating to spell sometimes. Last fall, my friend Adrienne planted a salvia border where she had all these salvias, and I was going to give a talk in August in Hickory, and I passed by and she showed me, and it wasn't in bloom yet, and so I was like, I gotta come back again. And so in October, I went to meet my family in the mountains, and sure enough, this whole thing was just in full bloom. Absolutely spectacular. Lots of different cultivars that she was trialing in there, mixing together. Looks great in the spring too, when they plant their bulb displays and have them out there in their nice sort of formal garden arrangements as well too. Really interesting plants there as well. One thing that you'll notice as we're going through tonight is that the places that are sort of closer to us, I put a few less photographs in than the places further away, because it's sort of sometimes a little bit harder for you to get to those places. So maybe whetting your appetite just a little bit more to sort of journey out a little bit. Pele smoke, the sugar cane, which I tried down in Costa Rica, and man, I tell you what, I think that this is like something unexplored for us here in the Southeast. To be able to take and cut open sugar cane and just eat it raw, it's amazing. Like, I would bring that plant in every winter to try to figure it out. So whether or not it has purple foliage or green, I don't care. It's really, really an interesting plant. Another really cool plant that I fell in love with there at the Paul J. Ciener Botanic Garden was Cliftonia. It's a native to the southeastern U.S. It sort of grows down further south through Georgia and Alabama, down in that area. But it's also called the buckwheat shrub, or the buckwheat tree. And the reason they call it that is because these seeds, whenever they form in the late summer, early fall, they sort of look like little buckwheat seeds. So it's an interesting plant, definitely something that'll catch your interest and be different, that'll stand out. Of course, there as well, they did some interesting color combinations. Forest pansy redbud, see everywhere around here. Lady Banks rose, see everywhere around here. But look when you combine them together, what a stunning color combination that is. That pastel yellow with that dark, rich purple. Something that we can easily do in our gardens at home. And then of course, they also had some interesting plants as well too. Look at the foliage on this kalanchoe. Man, I just went wild whenever I first saw it. It sort of looks like a dinosaur plant. Another garden that they introduced me to in the Triad area was Wyatt LaFever. And what's interesting about Wyatt is that he was one of the first people who bred the butterfly koi. And so he said, like, one day, I think he and his son were out there, and they noticed this koi that had these prettier fins on it. And his son, I think, made the comment, that sort of looks like a butterfly koi. So he's been able to sell these, make a lot of money off of them. And so I think he has then donated a lot of that money back to the Arboretum. But lots of really, really cool plants there at Wyatt's place. Like this cyclamen here, he had cyclamen all over the place. They were actually seeding into the lawn. You'd just be walking along and there'd be cyclamen all over there, all through the grass and everything. So really a great gardener to visit. Another really, really cool place to visit horticulturally is High Point University in the TRIAD. And this place has a lot of money, y'all. To sort of put it in perspective, John Rothling, they moved this about 30-foot tall Abies Fraseri. They dug it up and hauled it on a truck and then planted it there because I think it was one of the plants that JC actually first introduced to some urban site. They were trying to get urban trees introduced, and they were going to do some construction, and it was July. And so he talked to a lot of people like Richard Olson, Andrew Bunting. They gave it a 50-50. Unfortunately, it didn't end up making it, but still, just to be able to witness like how much they're willing to put into horticulture is great. Another really, really cool thing about High Point, they hire a bald eagle to fly out over the graduating class every year. So again, just sort of stressing, this place is definitely unique. But John has done some really, really great things there horticulturally, tried to really beautify the campus and make it something that the students and faculty really enjoy. Charlotte was another place that I initially branched out to horticulturally and saw some of the things down there. And the Daniel Stowe Botanic Garden was actually one of the first botanic gardens that I visited outside of the Raleigh area. I think it was the summer of 2009. And so went there, and I've gone back a couple different times. In my opinion, one of the most spectacular points to go is in the fall when these Muhlenberg are in flower. They took them out last fall, though, to turn it into sort of like a color border where they graded it from purple all the way down to yellow at the other end. And that was just as spectacular as well, too. The conservatory, if you haven't been down there, is worth checking it out. They've got these archways of air plants that sort of hang down and drape there. And then, of course, the pergolas that they have, a lot of these vines and stuff growing up on. And I just love how this light casts a shadow here as well, too, down there. Great color combinations as plants well. You've got Vertigo Pinacinum up there, as well as Colocasia Mojito. And to sort of zoom in, I love how these spots in this leaf are also picked up by this dark purple leaf as well too. And I'm surprised they let me into the garden that day because I was outside laying down. I was like taking photographs upside down through this leaf because I think it's absolutely incredible to be able to capture this color. And I'm also wondering if maybe they didn't name it Mojito because some of the gardeners, whenever they first found this plant, didn't end up on the ground looking up through the leaves, after they had had a couple of mojitos. Another good plant down there, Margaritaville yucca. It's one that I admired back in Tennessee whenever I was there, so it was fun to find a plant that was familiar to me whenever I came here. There's also new plants there, Stokesia, Mary Gregory, I love Stokesia. And normally they come in purple, and you also have white forms as well too, but this is actually a yellow flowering form. And I bought it and got it in my plant, or at my apartment, and just sort of waiting until I can get a house one day to plant it out. Another place that I visited whenever I was in Charlotte for the Substrates Conference that Dr. Bilderback also went to a couple years ago was the UNC Charlotte Botanic Garden. And so to go there and see that they had, made these large bog gardens where they could have these carnivorous plants housed was really, really neat. And then to go through the greenhouses and find that they had a Morphophallus in there that was not in bloom. I wouldn't have gone in if it had been in bloom. But because I had a friend who she actually did her master's at UNC, and she said that a couple years ago it did flower, and they practically had to wear a gas mask around this plant because it stunk so bad. So, but then to go outside the greenhouses and check out the Moongate, and then nearby to have one of my favorite perennials, Spigelia marylandica planted. So you've got that nice red color echo there as well too. Really, really great. It was a nice garden to go visit for the day. And of course, when you're in Charlotte, you also have to check out Winghaven Gardens. Winghaven was a garden that was started by a lady and her husband because they had a real passion for birds. She tells, when you go inside, you can watch this video, and she'll talk to you about how she was able to she could raise her hand up, and these bluebirds would just come and light on her fingers because they had raised them up from since they were just baby chicks. The best time to go is in the spring when all the wildflowers are still in bloom. But even if you go later in the summer, there's still a lot to see. There are quotes everywhere there. And this is one of my favorite ones that was instilled in me whenever I was an undergraduate in a geology class. And the quote is, if you can't read it, "To a person uninstructed in natural history, a country stroll is a walk through a gallery filled with wonderful works of art, 9/10 of which had their faces turned to the wall." So it's really an appreciation to get out, learn about the world, and see different things. And of course, even when you don't have birds, you still have a couple of little mammals running around like chipmunks and stuff. Another great place to go see down in the Charlotte area, if you get the chance, is the Bartlett Arboretum. Greg Page is a curator down there, and they have a very, very large magnolia collection where they have a lot of different cultivars. Greg also does a lot of different projects, just in general tree-wise. And here I'm with Tom Rainey and a lot of his crew from the mountains, and we're looking at some pollarded sycamores that Greg has done. And so these are a couple here, and then in a couple of different other areas, he's actually got them straight up, so they look like telephone poles. Really, really interesting. A lot of people say that they really know how to do pollarding over in Europe, and then here in the U.S. we just sort of top trees. There's no rhyme nor reason to it. But Greg also does a lot of great research there too on trees and how they also grow in urban areas. So what we see here is he has actually put in a sidewalk trial. They put in sidewalk, planted trees right up next to it, and then sort of put different conditions around the trees. For example, in one area, he put down the concrete, and they put down styrofoam, and they put down the concrete on top of it. And so what happened is that as those roots grew up, the styrofoam was able to absorb some of that shock from those roots being able to grow up. And so these are sort of the things that they do down there to try to figure out how to grow trees better in urban environments. Another really neat horticultural place in North Carolina is Asheville. There's a lot of different botanic gardens there, and there's also a lot of natural sites to see as well too. The North Carolina Arboretum, I was fortunate enough to be able to go there a couple of years ago. Someone told me that I've got to go back because they've made a lot of changes since I've been there, but one of the plants that I absolutely fell in love with whenever I first went there was cherry brandy rudbeckia. This is an incredible plant. I've grown it in a container at my apartment. It just has this vibrant, vibrant red color to it. So absolutely astounding. Red's my favorite color. I like it so much I even put it in my name. Really? No laughs? People always laugh at that. Oh my goodness. I get the Subway jokes and Diamond Store jokes all the time. I was trying to spice things up a little bit. Continuing on, we also have bonsai at the North Carolina Arboretum as well too. It's really interesting to go there and see that they had bonsai beech, that they had bonsai or bald cypress, and hey, they'll even bonsai a Virginia creeper. They'll bonsai anything if you want them to. Then to go over to Biltmore and see horticulture on a nice, massive scale. This is one of my favorite plants that I've fallen in love with whenever I've seen it throughout North Carolina, and this is Gomphrena fireworks. It's a wonderful plant. I know they trialed it here in the beds a couple years ago. It did really, really well. It's done really well for a friend of mine in Tennessee as well too. So great plant, blooms practically all summer long for you. Throughout the grounds, you find a lot of other interesting plants. Thunbergia, this is grandiflora. I am falling in love with Thunbergia. I've just planted a red one at my apartment just a couple of weeks ago, and it's already begun flowering, so I'm just going to train it up a vine. But Armitage talks about how this is a great annual. It's not very hardy for us. You have to bring it in and protect it potentially. But a lot of Thunbergia are really, really neat. And then I even love how the sepals still hang on to that flower after it falls off. Their containers are spectacular. You've got Melianthus here, which is the peanut butter plant. You rub the foliage and it smells like peanut butter. You've got lime zinger back there in the background, one of my favorite xanthosomas. And then of course you've also got this Uwharrie here as well too, with those purple orbicular leaves. That's got really nice contrast there with all that different foliage in that container. Biltmore has a lot of azaleas as well too. Azalea prunifolium, the plumleaf azalea, one of the last azaleas to flower that we have that's native. This is what Callaway Gardens is really known for, because this azalea sort of only grows within about a 60-mile radius of it. It's even on their emblem for it. And if you zoom in and look at the flowers up close, you'll see that not only are they red, but then also you have the styles and as well the stigmas there. It sort of just looks like someone took and slivered off licorice. You almost just want to get down in there and eat it. And then just some interesting, quirky, horticulture as well too. How many people in here have iris? Yeah, a lot of us have iris. And you know what? It blooms, so it looks great for 3 weeks of the year, and then the next 49 weeks you just got to look at sort of spiky green foliage. Well, look what they did here. They took and planted coleus around it. And so now we don't just have green foliage or red foliage. We have this interesting dynamic of this large red leaves and these green sword-like leaves coming up through it. So it's an interesting play on texture and color as well too. Now we've gone towards the mountains, so let's head back towards the coast and look at some of the great horticulture there. Just this weekend, so this is fresh on my mind, Liz Meyer, who's a teacher here at State, and I had a wedding to go to down along the coast, and so it was in Newbern. So hey, when you're in Newbern, might as well stop by Tryon Palace. The wedding was actually like 2 blocks away, so it was perfect location. So we stopped, look at the beautiful knot gardens that they had. Of course, Liz could not help but resist herself to take and brush over those nice manicured shrubs a little bit, going crazy there. I asked her if she was going to be here tonight. She said no, and I said okay. And then I put a picture of her here, So if you're not going to be here, I'll stick a picture of you in here. So, also throughout the gardens, they had great cottage-style-like areas where they had a lot of really cute, quaint English-style wildflowers growing, like this likeness here that has this great dissected petals on it. It's really interesting. Then to go over to their kitchen gardens and see how they had neatly arranged all their edibles into nice rows and squares and circles, and it really was great. It was almost like being back in England again to see how they did their vegetable gardens over there, and great color from a lot of these different plants like this California poppy. They had California poppies down there just left and right. I was surprised to see so many of them. I know they plant them some here in medians and stuff, but it was just a pleasant surprise to see that they had planted those down there and that they were in full bloom. Another place to go if you're along the coast and down near Wilmington is the new Hanover Arboretum. And it's got some nice parts to the landscape, and then it's also got some interesting plants like colocasia coffee cups. The colocasia will actually catch water whenever it rains on it. And they even have some interesting opuntia, like this one here, that's also known as the buffalo tongue opuntia. And I think you can sort of get an idea as to why they have named that common name. Now, another great passion of mine besides plants is Christmas. And so a couple years ago, I told some friends of mine, I said, I know a couple of different places that we can go and see some really cool Christmas lights. And so we took a trip down first to Charlotte and then back up through Greensboro to see some of the great things for Christmas. This is down at Daniel Stowe. They start putting Christmas lights on in late September, and they just go all throughout the garden laying down Christmas lights. And you can see here how they've done it near their fountains and their water canal here as well too. And here's a fun little tidbit that I saw in a garden a couple years ago. They took and put Christmas lights through ornamental grasses, like sort of Muhlenbergia-like type grass. And so then when they light up, those blades in there just sort of radiate that light out. So it's an interesting thing that you might want to try at your house sometime. But to set up the tripod and be able to capture some of these photographs at night was really great, so it didn't get too blurry. And then we drove through McAdenville, and we saw some of the Christmas lights that they had put up there along the riverbank. And to see some of these trees, that's the top of the house right there, and look at how much taller this tree is here. To see them essentially totally covered in Christmas lights was a great experience. McAdenville renames itself Christmas Town, USA during the winter time to sort of commemorate that. We ended our trip that night, and it was getting very late because it was about midnight by the time we got to Greensboro. But hey, we'll push and go as fast and as far as we can. And we went through this community in Greensboro where they had taken and made Christmas lighted balls. They took and meshed chicken wire together, wrapped it up with Christmas lights, and they used potato guns to shoot them up in the trees. And so, they said, I read online, they said, you can always tell when people start getting ready to hang them up because you'll start hearing all the potato guns going off. And it all started because a girl, I think she went to NC State, she and her dad made a couple, and she was standing by the window that night, and after they hung them up, she was like, Dad, a car slowed down. So they've now turned this into a big canned food drive where they take and people will bring canned goods and then they donate that to those people who are in need. So we've looked at a lot of different gardens that are in North Carolina, but there's also a lot of different wild places as well too, sort of these natural native areas. Chris was talking about earlier going to these islands that have these really cool, great plants, and if we get out and start exploring here in North Carolina, we can also find some really cool and interesting great plants. Whenever I look back and sort of, there's almost a point in my time here in Carolina where I can point back and say, like, that's whenever I started going around and doing a lot of this botanizing, looking at wild areas. And I can sort of point to 3 things looking back on the year before that happened that I know sort of helped to sort of thrust me in that direction. One of the first things that happened was that I bought the book Chlorophyll in His Veins, and I read it on the way to Singapore. That sort of gives you an idea of how long the flight to Singapore is. It's, I think, 21 hours in the air, so it's a long trip. But I read that and read about J.C. Raulston and his great ambitions and his searching the world for a lot of the great plants, and so it sort of began to stir this curiosity in me as far as, what else does, North Carolina or what else do other areas of the world have as well too. Sure, I've been botanizing around my house a little bit back in Tennessee, but I hadn't really ventured out a lot. The second thing that happened was that summer I flew over to Seattle and was at a wedding, and what you can't tell is that I've actually torn a tendon in my foot at the wedding. What happened, I got back and everyone was like, oh, did you do it dancing? And I was like, no, I actually did it taking photographs. I stepped wrong on a step coming down, and it just happened. And so basically what this meant is that for the next 6 months, NCIS and I became really, really good friends because I watched it every night. I just get Bojangles and sit there and stuff. And so I wasn't getting out, I wasn't dancing, I wasn't doing all these active things that I was used to. And so it was like, I've got to get out and do something. And then IPPS was held in Raleigh that fall, and I heard Todd Lassane and several others give talks about how they had traveled around the world looking for plants and stuff, and I was like, next year is the year. And next year became the year. So 2011, I started locally branching out and looking at some of the wild places, like, for example, Hemlock Bluffs, going down there and seeing all the erythronium that were in flower too. And then just being able to walk around different places like Lake Johnson. You can even find some nice things there too, like this fairy wand flower. Whenever I first found this in the wild, I was like, this sort of looks like a wild veronica or something like that. I wasn't even noticing the venation of the leaves to know that it was actually a monocot. So I went home and looked at wild veronica. And just a word of advice, don't go home and look at wild veronica or wild rose or anything else, because plants will not be the first thing that comes up. So, but I finally figured out what it was, and I was like, okay, that's good, learning a little bit about the world. Another place that I went to that first spring after I decided to make a real move to finding some of these wild plants and wild places was the Uwharrie National Forest. And it's only a couple of hours away. But go down there and actually find that, it's sort of a very, very wooded area. And then to go out in the woods and find these things like hepatica of all different colors, light blue to dark blue, and then Sanguinaria canadensis. And then to find that nature actually put some of them together, just like we might in a garden, to play off these color combinations that happen. So really, really beautiful. Some people have asked me before, Jared, how in the world do you do all you do? You travel around to all these different places and everything, and you're a grad student, you're busy. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. One thing that really helps me out is that I have a real drive. I don't need caffeine, I don't need energy drinks. I can just go, go, go. Another thing is that I really, really capitalize on time. So Easter weekend 2011 coincided with whenever I heard was the peak weekend of bloom at Biltmore. And so what I did is I made a point to visit 6 different places in practically Saturday and Sunday within like a 48-hour period. So everybody ready? Here we go. The first place I went to was Biltmore, and it was absolutely spectacular. Tulips were in peak bloom. Not only that, but you had seen all these different areas where they created all these nice color combinations. And the other reason it's peak now is because also the azaleas are in full bloom as well too. And so I got to enjoy a lot of our natives that were in flower. Like for example, Rhododendron austrina, the flame azalea from Florida, or the Florida azalea, excuse me, grows down there, but it will also perform well for us up here in North Carolina. My parents have one in Tennessee as well too. Rhododendron paraclimenoides as well, has those pink flowers on it. I remember this one from back in Tennessee. You can go down in the swamps there and find it growing where it's so thick, you know, the sun doesn't even hit the ground. Rhododendron alabamensis has a white petal to it, and really, really nice plant. It grows throughout Alabama and up into Tennessee. And then one of my favorite rhododendrons is Rhododendron vasii, which is a very rare rhododendron, only occurs naturally in a couple of different places in North Carolina. So to see that at Biltmore as well too was really, really neat. All right, rushed from Biltmore and went down to the Pink Beds Trail. The interesting thing about Pink Beds Trail is that it's named for the swamp pinks, Helenias bellata, which is a rare plant that grows in the mountains of North Carolina. It's the southernmost population. It also occurs in a couple of different other places up in like New Jersey. And so I went and walked about a 3-mile loop. I walked and I walked some more. I walked through some places where the rhododendrons were almost so thick that they even began to cast a dark shade on the ground. Found a couple of interesting things like the painted Trillium undulatum there as I was walking. And I was getting very, very close to the parking lot and I almost given up hope in finding this plant, when all of a sudden I saw someone standing here taking some pictures of this fiddlehead. And I was like, oh, that's nice, you know. And so she and I got to talking a little bit. And so she's like, oh, she said, did you see the swamp pinks? And I was like, where? And so she said, oh, they're just right back there along the side of the trail. And so went back there and sure enough found it. This is it right here. It has these flowers that come up from these basal foliage. And you can sort of zoom in. It's a nice pink, pretty flower on it. But I think that just sort of attests to the fact that when we gardeners travel to these different areas, it's a great thing to make connections, to talk and make new friends and learn about plants in places that we're not necessarily familiar with. From there, I left and drove down to Whitewater Falls, and of course enjoyed the beautiful vista there, and then walked the very, very, very long hike down through just a very narrow pathway, but saw a lot of cool plants on the way down, like Trillium discolor. And sort of the entire place had this like slight lemony sweet smell from some of these flowers that were blooming. And another really cool plant that I saw there was Trillium vasii, which these petals are so sort of velvety, it almost reminds me of like velvet cake. And to give you an idea of the size of these, I held my lens cap up there. So we're talking a pretty large, sizable bloom on this plant. So really interesting to be able to see that. And of course, you can also find some oddballs on these trips. For example, I found this slightly variegated Suga canadensis as I was walking back up and took a photograph of that. And you can sort of see how the ends of the leaves here sort of have a white coloration to them. So just an interesting quirk. Of course, this is Easter weekend, and pretty much every Easter, spent going to Easter sunrise service. And so I was like, hey, I'll just have my own up on top of a mountaintop. So got up early that morning and went and did that. And then I next went to the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest, where it was just absolutely a magical morning. I mean, it was almost like a place where ants could walk. And the reason you sort of had this feeling is because you were standing next to these giant, giant liriodendrons, these giant tulip trees. This is a virgin forest, so they've never gone through here, never cut the trees, and they're just giant mammoths in here. I once heard that in a museum in the Smokies that a family could have enough wood to build an entire cabin for one of these giant trees. So really, really interesting to go and be able to see these giants standing here. The forest floor was carpeted with tiarella, flocks of arcata as well too. And then one of the most interesting things that I've seen out on some of these trips is something called a nursery log. Has anyone heard of a nursery log? Yeah. They're fascinating. So basically what it is a log that after it falls down, all these plants begin to grow on it. So, on this log here, it's covered with tiarella. And then another really cool thing in the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest is you can actually see where some of these trees have grown on these logs, put down roots, and the logs underneath have totally dissolved away. I mean, it sort of looks almost like, these Ents, that we read about in The Lord of the Rings. They almost look like they just pulled the roots up out of the ground and are beginning to walk across the forest floor. So really cool to be able to go out in a wild place in North Carolina and see this. Of course, in some of these places, you begin to see some of the tragedy that's happened from human interactions. For example, in the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest, what they had done is everywhere I saw these trees where, it just looked like they had just been totally windblown by a tornado, and that's what I initially thought it was. But come to find out, what had happened is that all these Canadian hemlocks had died from the adelgid damage, and so what they had gone in and done is they went in, drilled holes in the trees, put dynamite in there, and then blew them all at once to sort of mimic natural falling from an ice storm or something like that. And of course, they had to go through and cut up some of these, but it was tree after tree after tree that you went through and saw in this area. Really sad. One day, I get bored easily because I don't have television anymore. I used to have NCIS, but now I don't. So I just sat down one day and started counting rings, and I made it up to about 250 at least. So really old trees that we're talking about here when you're looking at some of these. The next place I went to after the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest was Tatham Gap Road, which if you can't read the sign, it says that this road was a part of the Trail of Tears, originally built about 1838 to remove the Cherokee Indians to Oklahoma. And I was like, whenever I found out about the history of this place, I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I want to go, see this road, see it because this is a part of our history as a culture, as a nation. And I thought, surely there's going to be some wildflowers along this road too that I might run into or bump into because it's an old deserted road. And in some places I didn't even want to get out of the car because it's basically it's pretty much as far as you can see up there. It just keeps on going straight down. So, but the interesting thing is that there weren't really a lot of wildflowers along this. You drove like no trilliums, nothing very common. I saw a couple going in and a couple going out. But I thought that was maybe a little bit interesting to sort of say, maybe it's nature's way of mourning, what went through here. So, I don't know, it was an interesting experience, an interesting drive personally. From there, I went to Buck Creek Barrens, which is a serpentine barren over in North Carolina. They occur up and down the East Coast, and there's basically just relics from the continental collision that happened and formed the Appalachians. But these areas are very rich in magnesium, and so a lot of trees, as you can see sort of against the background here, can't grow in this area. So what this does is this allows some unusual and different plants to be able to grow here. And so walking the power lines, notice, they have Indian paintbrush growing here, just wild, as well as trailing arbutus. It's an endangered wildflower that grows here in North Carolina. I've even been fortunate enough to see it here in Wake County as well too, in one of the parks. And then just some of these other cool like polygala, really interesting plants that grow in this area too. And if you go back in the fall, you can also find some things there flowering too. Stone Mountain was really a fun trip that I took with a couple of friends of mine, not Georgia. You tell people you've gone to Stone Mountain and they're like, oh, Georgia. And you're like, no, North Carolina. Even though it's not as famous as the Georgia one, it's still a really neat mountain. And if you don't know a lot about geology and how mountains form, Stone Mountain is slightly different because the way it formed is that it was basically a big blob of lava beneath the Earth's surface. And slowly as the Earth's surface eroded away, this blob of lava just sort of exposed itself. So it's almost like, licking a lollipop and getting to the bubble gum at the center. That's sort of doing the exact same thing here. And so I went with two of my friends from the horticulture department, Jason and Kelly. we went up and checked out a lot of the cool plants there. And of course, you have to stop and look at everything, and then everyone has to get photographs of it, and then you have to take photographs of the people taking photographs. and then to go up on Stowe Mountain, and some of these areas, I mean, you can pretty much see the slope there. I mean, you have to get low, sort of hug the rock face as you're climbing up through that. But we eventually made it up to the top and celebrated that as well. Now, it's interesting whenever you're out on these trips because you've got 3 plant people, and so you think, well, we ought to be able to figure out a lot of these plants that we're seeing. We still found things that stumped us. This is, we finally found out that this is Vaccinium staminium, aka the deerberry. It's a really neat plant that grows there along the mountains. Took some photographs of that. Another really cool feature on the top of this was lines and natural bonsai. Just everywhere you looked, it was like these plants had just been twisted and contorted by the natural environment. And in some areas, the moss just covered the ground, and then you had all these nice little wildflowers that would spring up and grow through the moss as well too. And then, of course, Jason loves to get in there in those plant photographs and sort of take pictures with some of these natives that we love, like Cyananthus. So from there, we went to the Blue Ridge Parkway and celebrated a lot of finding, like some of these rhododendrons. Again, Jason wanted to get in another plant photograph, rhododendron calendulaceum. And then we also found this beautiful, beautiful form of Magnolia fraseri. And this photograph here is what I call a 1 in 10,000, where you go out, take a lot of photographs, and you get home on your computer and you're just like, wow, that turned out pretty well, I think. So to be able to go and capture some of these natural beauty in North Carolina is a real treat. Of course, even when Magnolia fraseri is going down in the fall, it still has a beautiful essence to it with the leaves there as they begin to become spotted, showing the aging from the year. The Blue Ridge Parkway is absolutely beautiful in the fall. There's a lot of different autumn colors. There's a lot of different autumn wildflowers like white goldenrod. You've also got gentians as well too that are blooming there along, just as you drive along, you can see them alongside the road. And then to go up to the top of Mount Mitchell and see some of the first frost of the season and as it blooms in, and hoarfrost form on this angelica. It's truly a magical place to go up and travel along the Blue Ridge. Really, really a rich place. Gregory Bald. Gregory Bald was a place that I heard about, and someone said, I read online, it said that if you're a gardener, you must experience Gregory Bald before you die. And I was like, okay, all right, if you say so. It's very, very far on the far side of North Carolina. Actually, half of it's in North Carolina, half of it is in Tennessee. I went with Tom Rainey and his crew once again to Gregory Bald. We stayed that night in Cades Cove. And one of the interesting things that we witnessed that night in Cades Cove is these mysterious lights that appeared. Not really what it is we set up my camera, put it on a 30-second shutter, and got out a bunch of different lights and started doing the colors and everything. Had a lot of fun playing around. We plant people can't be doing plant things all the time. Or can we? I noticed that this color was orange. I was like, hey, wouldn't it be really, really cool to do like a rhododendron, to like try to draw out a rhododendron? And I was like, here, I'll try first. And mine ended up looking like a rolled up like taco or a burrito or something. And then Kevin Paris, who was with us, he was like, here, let me give it a try. And I was like, dude, man, you actually might need to go into this. You're pretty good at this. So he also spelled out his daughter's names. We just had a blast that night. Of course, we had to get up before dawn, so we couldn't stay out drawing things all night long. Dawn in Cades Cove, my parents and I go here a lot whenever we meet up in the fall, and this is the fastest that I've ever been through Cades Cove in my life. Like Tom Rainey was just like booking it. Of course, good reason too. We had a 4-mile hike ahead of us to reach the top of Gregory Bald. So packed up, loaded up, got to the trailhead and started walking up this path. We walked some more, and when you think you're done walking, you're still walking. We hugged a couple of trees along the way, because if you're walking so much, you got to take some breaks. Kelly here hugging a tulip tree, and then of course Kevin had to get in there with magnolias, which he loves and adores. We learned a lot about from the Magnolia Symposium this past year. And then we got to the bald, and just it's sort of like the trees in the forest broke, the grass started, and then all of a sudden these orange azaleas started popping out everywhere, left and right. Just absolutely beautiful. Whether they were in flower, whether they were in bud, they were truly majestic to behold, just this entire hillside covered with these orange beauties. There was some color variation, if you notice. We've got dark red, we've got a peachy pink here, we've got a light yellow orange here, and another pink growing back there in the background too. So there is some color variation. They're not quite sure how they got up on the bald. Some people think that they may have actually collected, the people who used to live there collected them, brought them up on the bald whenever they were letting their cows out there to pasture. And of course, you know, we packed a lot of gear, but even the wildlife liked to eat. This deer was incredibly tame. Like, you know, it was just like standing there and just walk through and browse through people's bags. And a little bit of sleeping too whenever we got to the top as well. One of the great things about visiting Tom Rainey and palling out with his friends up in the mountains is you get to see some of the things that he's working on. And of course, a lot of you know this invincible spirit hydrangea. It's a great performer for us, but I just wanted to sort of show you how it looks after being on the ground about 1 or 2 years, and then this is the very next year. So absolutely an incredible plant to have. Just got to give it a lot of water and give it a lot of fertilizer to help it do well. Another place that I've enjoyed going here in North Carolina is the Green Swamp Preserve. And I have a slight fun story to tell about the Green Swamp Preserve. Whenever I was starting to look for some of these natural places to go in North Carolina, I was like, well, you know, there's not a lot on the information about some of these places, but one of the things that is online is Flickr. Flickr, people go online, post photographs of things they've done, and so I was able to go on Flickr and find some friends who have been to the Green Swamp Preserve. And so I added a couple of them and got into conversations with them. So get down to the Green Swamp Preserve, and this guy is walking up out of the swamp, and he and I get to talking, and I'm asking him, you know, like, well, did you see anything cool today? Did you see any plants that places you recommend checking out? And so he was telling me, you know, go across the road and everything. And I said, okay, great. I said, thanks. You know, my name's Jared Barnes. It was really nice to meet you. He said, oh, thanks. You know, my name is Skip Pudney. It was nice meeting you too. I said, Skip Pudney. I said, that name rings a bell with me. He's like, really? He said, I don't know how. And so I pulled out my phone and started looking on Flickr, and I said, are you on Flickr? And he said, yeah, I am. I said, yeah, you're one of my friends on here. And so it was crazy, you know? I mean, think of the chances of that he and I would both go on the same weekend. First, that I would find him on there, that we would both go on the same weekend, and that I would just happen to chance cross paths with him as he's leaving and I'm getting there. So he and I have kept in touch. We walked around a little bit on the other side of the road in these pine savannas, checked out a lot of the cool plants. The reason it was such a great weekend and that I decided to go down was because I saw people post on Flickr that the 3 native platantheras that we have here in North Carolina were all in flower at this time. And they said that this was the best year to go see them. And even some of them, it was really cool to see these praying mantis just sort of hanging there on some of these flowers. They were just sort of waiting for some of these butterflies to come by and snatch them. Lilium Catesbyii was in full flower. Some of the carnivorous plants were also looking great at this time of year. Everywhere you stepped, you were practically stepping on some of these Venus flytraps just because they were so thick in this area. Marshallia was also in full bloom when we were down there, and some of these like rush featherlings that look great this time of year were in bloom too. This is what I call the blazing star Milky Way, because it's basically blazing stars as far as you can see looking through the swamp. And then in November, Skip and I got in touch, and we went back down there. I met up with he and a couple of friends down there, and they were photographing Parnassia, as well as this Spiranthes longulabris. This is, one guy flew from Canada down there. And I took this photograph. So basically, you know, how many photographers can you find here? There's one that's pretty obvious. Then there's one laying down over there. There's one laying down over there. And you're like, man, these guys are really diehard. You know, one guy comes down from Canada, and then they pulled it out. They pulled out the black cloth for the orchid to photograph against. And it's like, wow, these guys really are diehard. You know, so it was really interesting being with some of these guys who love plants a lot. So, bring it home to Raleigh. I saved 2 of the best places, in my opinion, horticulturally, for last. The first one I want to talk about was my apartment complex. where I live, which has been deemed the jungle by a lot of my friends. Some of them come there and end up somehow getting lost before they leave because there's so many plants. But this has been a real fun project for me to do and to try to grow as many things and trial as many things in containers as I can. It's also been great to connect with neighbors. Like I've got this guy who lives up here, you can't see it in the photograph, but he's just like, he's fascinated by these plants. He's like, dude, man, what's that plant that looks like the cabbage down there? And I'm like, you mean the Echeveria? He's like, yeah. And then he tells me later, he said, I got online and read about this plant on Wikipedia. And it was so interesting to find out it's native to this place and everything. I'm like, dude, I got you hooked, man. This is exciting. A couple plants really quick that I've had great success with. Rojo banana. My friends think I'm crazy because I have that. Wait, you should have seen their looks whenever they walked into my apartment and saw a 7-foot-tall banana tree in my living room whenever I overwintered it this winter. So if you grow this in a container or have to move it in, just keep that in mind. I thought about even putting Christmas lights on it whenever I was decorating for Christmas. Another great plant that I love and have had going for a couple years is Aurelia Sun King. This is a die-hard plant. It grows well for me here in North Carolina. I know it's out in the pollinator garden. I've seen it up at the Maine Coastal Botanic Garden. I've even seen it in Portland, Oregon. So it's great. It holds its color up to about September whenever it starts going into flower, and then it begins to turn a little bit lighter shade or more of a darker shade of green. But in my opinion, it's one of the best plants that I grow. And Daphne Rebecca, to be able to have some winter interest during the year. The other great thing about growing this in a container, two great things. One, you get the drainage, which helps to combat some of the soil issues that you'll run into. The second thing is that you can bring this inside. So I can bring this inside, put it in my living room, and it'll smell up things. So whenever I have friends come over, they're able to enjoy the scent of the Daphne. And of course, being in 60, 70 degree temperatures just allows the aroma to go all throughout the room. So I think this is an unexplored area of horticulture to have some of these fragrant plants. And right now what I'm into at my apartment is making honeysuckle sorbet, which is a life-changing experience if you've never had it. It's really, really great. Crook's Corner was the one who turned a friend of mine onto the recipe, and then she shared it with me, and so I've been out picking it already this year with friends. There have been a couple of problems that I've run into with at my apartment. One is a little bit of vandalism. Came home one day and found a piece of gum on one of my tulip petals. And I mean, it's like, what? How? I don't understand. And then, of course, do you like the water garden that I've put in here? You never know when the water pipe's going to break, and then they're going to rip up the sidewalk, and then it's going to rain a lot, and then practically you're going to have to clear off a lot. Fortunately, this was in early spring, and so, a lot of these plants had not come up yet or had come out of the apartment yet too. So that's one thing my friends are always amazed when they come over during the wintertime and then see my apartment after all the plants have moved out. It's like, wow, you've got so much space here. This is incredible. And then finally, let's round it out with the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. I put just a couple of my favorite plants in this talk. Of course, I love the NCSU dwarf group, Loblolly Pines. It's got a fun story with it, and they're all over the place. There's a couple at Kilgore Hall, and they're scattered throughout the Arboretum here, but just whenever you go and collect seeds from witches' brooms and then sow them out, I think that's a great story that goes with it. One of the first plants that I photographed whenever I came and visited the Arboretum here in April, I came in April to check out the university and to meet with my future advisors and talk with them, was this Mexican dogwood. I thought these fused petals were way cool. And you think after you've been here for 5 years, you've seen everything here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum, right? I mean, you'd think you're out here walking around touring. No, I learned that lesson only a couple weeks ago. I'm out walking around and I've noticed in the back corner near the White Garden, there's this dogwood bloom, and I'm like, what? Why are the blooms so large? I walk over, and it's a multi-bract dogwood. I'd never seen this before, and I've been here dozens, well, not dozens, maybe like 100 times, to walk around and look at things. If you had told me whenever I came to Raleigh that I would be standing under 20-foot tall banana trees, whenever I moved here, I'd say, yeah, right. But J.C. Raulston Arboretum has definitely made me a believer that we can push the tropics into these more temperate areas as the temperatures begin to warm, and we can trial some of these bananas that will end up being hardy for us and growing. This photograph I think I just took last fall. And of course, my heart beats for Stachyurus during the springtime. I just absolutely love seeing all the different ones that they have here. And it's also love seeing a lot of these different winter interest plants like Salix flame that has these nice colorful stems in the wintertime as well too. So we began with dry falls, and of course we'll end with dry falls, because I think even after you've gone somewhere and experienced it once, you have to go back and see it again, because you never know what you're going to learn the next time you go there. So thank you for your attention tonight. Until next time.
Are there any questions for Jared?
Yes, ma'am.
What is the story of the loblolly pines and the wicked brood? What were you just saying? I didn't know.
Oh, sorry. They were collected, and I'll let some of the experts too in the audience correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they were collected with a shotgun from Witch's Broom in 1950, somewhere in there. Dr. Cochran, I believe was his name, sowed the seeds, and then from that they got a group of plants that were dwarf loblolly pines. And so now they've reached the age where it's hard to propagate them, but when they collect seeds out of the cones, about 1/4 of them come true to that dwarf trait. So it's a recessive trait that's carried on. So that's the interesting story behind it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Which one did you say was the peanut butter
Melianthus magus. Let's see its number. I can find it for you really quickly. Let's see. So more. Right here, it's number 53. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The guy, the Wyatt LaFever.
Yeah.
You mentioned the TRIAD. Is that open? Can somebody call, make a phone call, or email?
I want to think that maybe they have open days maybe during the springtime. He has a lot of azaleas that he's actually bred too, and so I think if you would call the Paul J. Ciener Botanic Garden and just say like, hey, I'm interested in visiting him. They've also got a website that I found as I was doing some of the research for this talk. They've got the website for their koi farm as well too. So I think if you go online and look up Wyatt LaFleur or LaFever, however you say it, I think I've usually heard it LaFleur.
Oh, okay.
No. I'm just, please, if somebody else knows, correct me. Yeah, I don't know. It's like, yeah, exactly. But I think if you go online and look that up plus the word koi, I think it'll pop up. So.
And it is connected, affiliated somehow with Ciener?
It's not. He's a good friend of theirs, and he's donated some money from the koi farm to them. But I know that I think he's a regular volunteer there, so he's involved with them. Yes, ma'am.
You've done a great job with this handout. But
Thanks.
what was the garden you were talking about? Who was primarily a species collector?
Charlie Keith, that's the Charles R. Keith Arboretum. Should be like number 21. Yeah, 21 down there. And that one is, I believe, open to the public. And he has visitors days, but you call and make an appointment. Yeah. And I know that now the J.C. Raulston is trying to pair up with him a little bit to do cataloging of some of his collections over there as well too. Yes, sir.
So what's next on your agenda? Yeah, the weekend's only 2 days away. Where are you going?
Let's see. This weekend, right. Well, this weekend's graduation, so I'm coming here. But the Southern Highlands Reserve is high on my list, mainly because the reason I wanted to give this talk now is because I'm graduating in December. I did not say that at the very beginning, so I'm beginning to wind down my time, and so it's sort of like if I can hit any other horticultural highlights while I'm in the area, because I don't know where, I could easily end up in Portland. And so I definitely want to spend as much time with friends, and then also see as much of the state as I can here. Like a year ago, I canceled my cable because I was just never home. And so, it was great. They called me up and they were like, please, if it's money, we'll take you back. And I was like, but you can't give me as much pleasure as plants can.
Airlie in Wilmington. You should go to Airlie Gardens.
I've heard of I wanted to try to make it whenever I was down there for New Hampshire. I was given a talk down there, and then I ended up just running out of time because it was getting kind of late that night. So.
Cape Fear Botanic Garden.
Good.
Yeah.
Tryon Palace, I went there this weekend, and I was just absolutely blown away because you think you go to some of these historic, everybody's been to a historical garden, they've got like basil and like lamb's ear, and you learn that, they used to have lamb's ear growing there because, you know, they needed to light the path to the outhouse at night. But I got to Tryon, and I was like, wow, this place is great. You know, like so much rich horticulture. You know, they had banana shrub, they had, you know, all these different plants from that time period done well. You know, so highly recommend going down there. It's only 2.5 hours away. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much,
Yeah,
Jared.
thank y'all
Really
for coming
appreciate it.
tonight.